All right, guys. So we are at the last section of SSLVPN, and we'll go ahead and get started. And we'll go over, like I said, monitoring SSLVPN. I showed you guys some of it, but also doing some troubleshooting. You guys have the study guide. Keep that in your back pocket because 9 times out of 10, it's going to come up, and you guys are going to have to go ahead and troubleshoot some SSLVPN users, maybe some routing issues. You may have to go into the GUI and flip some things around, and you guys may have to go into CLI, all these things. So hopefully, the goal here, right, is you guys can go ahead, you be able to, go to the section of the firewall to where you'll be able to, see who's connected, has a connected user on the VPN, right? You guys be able to look at those SSLVPN logs because they're not obvious in the 7 train. FortiOS, right? You guys be able to go ahead and set that idle timeout, those different timeouts, and change some timers, right? So it can be your end users can have better usability while working remotely. You guys will be able to troubleshoot, like I said, a lot of the issues. Maybe there's a routing issue, right? Maybe that routing override thing that we talked about. Maybe it's a DNS suffix issue, right? Maybe they can't get to resources per fully qualified domain name. A lot of things, right? So we're gonna go ahead and talk about some nuggets that Fortinet, talks about in the guide, and of course, some of this stuff that you can expound on with field experience. Okay, so first things first, right? And I do love this, right? Is that you can go ahead and look at the active SSLVPN sessions on your firewall, right? You can go to that, you log in, get to dashboard, go to the network portion, right? Not the actual network section, the network portion of the dashboard, right? 2 different things. And you get there and you can actually see, if you guys look at the screenshot, you can see user, you can see the SSLVPN tunnel IP address that has been assigned to your host, right? You'll be able to see the active session, see how long they've been connected. You'll be able to see, and what I love about the 7 train, you'll be able to see if it's tunnel mode or if it's web mode, right? You'll be able to see that. And from here, you can actually go ahead and disable, right? And disconnect sessions, right? You can go ahead and do that. You can actually look at logs, right click maybe one of the users. You can right click it and say show matching logs. It helped me a lot. And you can actually track based on what this tunnel IP is, track and see all the logs that have been tracked from the firewall, right? So it's super powerful. Super powerful. Okay. And like I said, you can end the session in the dashboard as well in the SSLVPN section. That makes sense? Any questions?
None for me.
No.
Okay. All right. So you guys have seen it before, right? There is a section on the firewall, right? To where it talks about, it shows SSLVPN, but it's not blatantly shown. So you have to dig for it, right? So first you have to go ahead and go to under log and report, right? In the left navigation bar, you have to click on events. Then within events, right? And as you guys can see in the middle, it's not a lot, blown up. So I fault the study guide for it. But it's a section on your top right next to the filter section, where you can click on which events you're trying to see. You have to click on VPN events to actually see it. So if you click on events, it won't automatically take you to VPN events. It's just going to take you to system events. So you would have to click, look at VPN events, and you guys can go ahead and track that session there. Okay. Again, you'll be able to see stuff for, connections for, for users that use tunnel mode. You'll be able to see, some authentication events, right? But that's it. It'll tell you, hey, tunnel is up. Here's some stats. A user connection was made. That's it. It's not going to tell you that maybe Donovan is trying to find a user that's remote, trying to access a remote, a resource that's behind the firewall, right? You have to dig a little bit deeper and go to your forward traffic logs and make sure that your policy, right? Maybe the policy that Makivia connected that's related to SSLVPN users reaching, going southbound, right? Coming from outside in, to go ahead and that she enabled logs so you can see that traffic that way, okay? So just have to manipulate it a little bit. This is just one other tool if you're trying to see if maybe you're trying to see, hey, did you get authenticated or not into the firewall, right? And if so, then you can move on to the next step. Maybe because you end user reached out and said they can't log to the firewall. Maybe they can't reach resources. So for me, this would be the first step I would check to make sure, did you at least authenticate, right? Did you, do I see a session in the dashboard? If I see that, excellent, right? If I see that, excellent. Layer 1 is done, perfect. From not layer 1 in the OSI model, but layer 1 is just making sure that you actually just got into it. That's fine. So now I can go ahead and get into the weeds and start, cracking my fingers and, looking at layer 3, all this stuff to see from layer 3 standpoint, do we have reachability? Why or why not, right? Because everything is a source and destination, right? But again, SSLVPN logs are very useful, help me out a lot. Hopefully you guys make it a part of your troubleshooting process as well, right? But we talked about, right? Right at the beginning of this call that I was gonna show you guys, the importance of timers. Timers, man, it can make the absolute difference, depending on the end users that you support. So you guys know it's easy, right? You can go ahead and set up SSLVPN, along with remote authentication, right? And so they would log into the firewall, and these remote users, maybe your sales team, maybe your engineering team, they'll be on, right? But they may not be working, right? The entire time that they're connected. And end users may forget. They may say, oh, I'll just stay connected. Let me go to, maybe Chick-fil-A, right? I'll go grab a bite to eat, right? It's dangerous, right? To have an idle session and there's nothing working, right? Because that's another attack vector, right? Maybe a threat actor is watching this end user's traffic, right? If we didn't have idle timeouts or what have you, right? It's always going to stay connected. And maybe what if that end user never came home? They came home hours after, right? Now that the attack vector is open, right? Right? If we never have that idle timeout, we're given more room for them to attack us. But with the idle timeout feature, right, and the authentication session timer feature, we can go ahead and say a few things, right? With the idle timeout, right, they'll be disconnected if there's no traffic traveling through the tunnel, right? By default, that's 5 minutes, aka 300 seconds, right? So if there's no traffic passing to the tunnel, right? If there's nothing happening, Marquise went ahead and set the idle timeout, idle logout, and to 300 seconds. He'll go ahead and log them out, right? Because there'll be no need, right? The purpose of SSLVPN is for an end user to reach resources. If it's not reaching resources, let's disable it, right? You can configure that within the GUI and of course within the CLI, right? But what do I mean with the authentication session, right? It talks about how much of how long a user will be authenticated within that session. That's a bit different, right? Idle timeout is hit the wrong one. Idle timeout has to do with how long an activity happens. Authenticated session means for how long, right? You'll be authenticated on the firewall, right? So maybe that same end user we were talking about, they were authenticated through SSLVPN, right? And they worked the whole day, but they got to work after hours, right? If we're using the default timers, right, and they don't show it here, but the authentication session timer maybe is set to 8 hours. After 8 hours, the FortiGate will kill the session, and they would have to go ahead and log into the SSLVPN again. That's what it means for the authentication session timeout, right? So idle timeout, authentication session timeout, two different things. I want you guys to know the difference, okay? Right? In the sake of troubleshooting, because you may have users that call in and say, hey, I'm getting disconnected or what have you, right? While I'm working, that's something different, right? You can go multitude of ways. So you being able to look at these two things, idle timeout, authentication timeout, it's a great thing to look at before you jump up to layer 3 and check anything. Hey, maybe it's your ISP, maybe it's your, maybe something's going on in the Fortigate. This is a good thing to check before you go to the upper levels. Does that make sense?
Was it me? Or I think you just cut. Oh, my internet connection. Yikes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. You kind of cut out when you said the authentication, when you went over the authentication timeout,
Okay.
and then when you just went over that, I don't know the last part when you came over. I'm sorry, my
No,
internet dropped.
it's okay. Hey, it might have been mine too, so it's all good. So, there's a difference between idle timeout and authentication session timeout. Authentication session timeout is the limit that you have for your session, for your active session, right? So, you can, authentication session timeout, you have a limit of being 8 hours connected consecutively on the VPN. Whether you're working or not, it'll disconnect you after 8 hours, and you'll have to. And 8 hours it's not a default time. It's just I'm just using that as an example, right? After 8 hours, it'll disconnect you. You have to reconnect again.
Okay.
Okay. Idle timeout is there's no activity traversing, and I'm talking from a network standpoint. There's no activity traversing the SSL VPN tunnel. You're not actively working on a computer. There's nothing. It's going to disconnect.
Okay. Gotcha.
That's idle logout. Do you understand the difference?
Yep.
Okay. Mike Evie, you're good?
Yep, I'm good.
Okay, cool. All right, so SSLVPN timers, right? This is very important to go ahead and take a look at, right? Whenever users, right, they're connected to, SSLVPN, right? Sometimes, right, they may be connected to a ISP or a they may be connected to an ISP, or they're and that connection may have high latency, right? And it's terrible, right? They're trying to connect up or what have you. What the FortiGate can do, they can go ahead and terminate that session, right? Before they even finish, try to communicate with the FortiGate to try to negotiate. Hey, I'm ready to go ahead and create a SSLVPN tunnel if my internet's taking too long. They can go ahead and time it out, right? Because it's taking too long. It's certain timers, right? And that timer I just spoke about is, of course, DTLS hello timeout, and of course, the login timeout. All these timers you can go ahead and set for your end users, right? In the sense of, them, of the sense of them logging in, of course, keeping your firewall safe. A lot of these values have default timers, right? As you can see, the DTLS hello timeout, right? 10 seconds, login timeout, 30 seconds, right? You can change it, maybe because maybe it's not an ISP issue on the end user side, maybe ISP issue or internet issue on your side, right? Until you get things fixed, right? You can go ahead and address this with under SSL config VPN SSL settings, right? So you can manipulate some of the timers. You can go ahead and manipulate some and get even deeper into the weeds, right? And manipulate some of the HTTPS requests whenever that negotiation is happening between the end user and the firewall. You can manipulate it to the point to where you can go ahead and say, hey, the negotiation can happen, but here is the limit on this part of the negotiation process, right? My header, my bot, hey, listen, you only have a little bit of time, right? Because all an attacker needs is 5 seconds, if that, right? Because now everything is automated, right? To go ahead and attack, right? And maybe do a, man the middle attack, right? Of course, the PowerPoint says denial of service. All that can happen, right? So Don and Mykevia setting up their firewalls, it's the one thing that they would have to think about, right? And maybe you have your, right, the scenario will be you have your you have your firewall in production. This is one thing you can look at if you're starting to see a lot of people, hey, I can't really disconnect quick, right? Maybe it's somebody that's trying to get into the middle. So you can go ahead and, manipulate some of these timers. That makes sense?
Yes.
Okay. All
I
right.
got a question about the times. Is that the how it was 10 to 180, 10 to 60? Is that
Mhm.
like the max? Like 60 seconds is the max you can set that to?
You got it.
Okay.
Good question. All right. So best practices, right? Of course, there's a little bit more, and of course, off the record from Fortinet, they have a great community section um, that I use a lot to go ahead and learn a few things, what have you. It's great to see that they've improved a lot as far as within their study guide, as far as best practices. But these are some that are great, right? For just going in and being a new admin of a Fortigate fresh off your NSE4, right? So, couple things, right? And this is relating to SLVPN, right? Um, Encouraging your end users, which I don't agree with this, um, encouraging your end users to enable this cookie in your web browser, right? Um, Setting up internet privacy settings, right, to high, right, in the web browser, right? Making sure, right, we got a most recent and compatible version of FortiOS, right, for your end users, right? My favorite thing, make sure split tunneling based on your design is enabled, right? Or make sure that you have an egress firewall policy for SSLVPN connections, right? To allow access for external resources, right? And what they mean by that is, right, you have them connect the firewall. Maybe it's the traffic flow is for them to get out to the internet. You have split tunneling disabled, right? And so that now they have to go into your network and go back out so you can track the traffic. Make sure you have that firewall policy that says for SLVPN interface, go out when one, you're allowing internet traffic now for your SLVPN users. If you don't have split tunneling enabled, just make sure you have that, right? And this is just more so a good checklist for you. Make sure they're connected to the correct port number, right? Make sure that setting is in FortiClient. Um, a couple of things that we went over with configuration settings, right? SSL VPN groups, SSL VPN users, destination addresses, right? That routing override we talked about. And make sure the firewall policies are correct, right? Um, Make sure we're flushing inactive settings by timeout, right? So make sure we're not making the timeout more than needed just because they complain, right? A lot of things, and I had to learn this, is we don't bend too much at the will of end users. We have to make sure and we roundtable everything and we say, hey, they say they want an idle timeout of 8 hours. Well, absolutely not. You know what I'm saying? Like it's we don't listen to all the requests. You guys have to, with you guys being NSC, candidates, right? And that will be, certified one day. You guys don't now just think about the network. You have to think about security as well, right? So your mindset needs to shift to dually. So you're thinking about network, right? Maybe you're thinking about design, you think about layer 3, but you also need to think about security. How can I go ahead and provide traffic flow, but also put in security at the same time? Okay, just like how roads are made and we have stoplights, right? We go and make a system to the points where people can get to point A to point B, but we need those stoplights in place, security, so that act as guardrails for everything to flow nicely. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Let's go ahead. All right. My favorite command, the diag command, aka diagnose, right? Couple of things you can go ahead and use to troubleshoot, right? Of course, first you have to do a diag debug enable, right? So you can start seeing some things. After you do that, you can do, or you can do vice versa, right? You can put your commands first and then do enable. I personally like to do the commands first, right? Do diag VPN SSL. I like to set my filters first and then do enable so then it can pop out, et cetera, et cetera. So then if I want to disable, it's just quick diag debug disable, right? But that's just me. But yes, multiple commands, right? You can use lists, show you your current sessions in the CLI, right? Makibi, we were just talking about this, right? CLI is very important. You guys can look at, the general SSLVPN information using info, use it statistics, right? You can actually look at the logs, right? And this is where the debug filter comes in. So you can create a filter to where, hey, I want to check this IP address, this port number, they're trying to get to X, Y, and Z. You can do that with the debug filter command, right? You can also go ahead and check the hardware acceleration status, right? Because maybe the specialized chip that's in the FortiGate is being, is accelerating operations for SSLVPN. You can go ahead and check that if you haven't disabled it, right? My favorite two commands, last but not least, tunnel test and web test, right? So you can do this within the CLI and test to see, hey, do I have the proper allocation for IP addresses? Can end users connect? Does everything work? Excellent, boom, right? You can also do the same thing for web mode. So testing those two things, it will help you in your process to deduce, okay, nothing's wrong with my firewall. The SSLVPN server, right? Server function from the FortiGate, right? It acting as a server can listen to connection requests on configured Forti clients. Bet we can move on to something else. So those are, if y'all don't learn anything else from me, I need you to lock in those last two commands. Okay. Last but not least, at the end of course, the end of the PowerPoint slide you guys can see, they have all-time favorite, right? You can debug based on the entire process of SSL VPN, right? But with great power comes great responsibility. If you guys use these two commands, it's dangerous. It's going to pop out a lot of logs because you're debugging the entire SSL VPN process with a lot of logs. And we talked about it in section 6. With all of these logs, it can overburden the CPU. So, how are you guys? I would personally not do this on the firewall. Okay. It can, if you're in production, right, it can halt the firewall, right? Because of course the CPU is getting overburdened. So let this be your last resort. When I say last resort, I mean it's already in a broken state, right? So maybe your firewall is in a down state or a in a not working state. Then go ahead and do it. But troubleshooting, especially during production, outside of production, I wouldn't do it. Okay. All right.
Got it.
All right. We talked about hardware acceleration. I know I threw it out there here and there, right? With the the specialized processes, right? And let me say the correct term, the content processes, right? C8, CP8, CP9, right? It can go ahead again, accelerate certain functions within the. It can dedicate itself to specific functions within the firewall, right? To alleviate some overhead on the actual CPU, right? What are those services or resources it's offloading? It's taken over from these CPU, UTMs, right? Antivirus, all that. We have a dedicated chip for that, right? SSL VPN traffic. We can offload some traffic for that, right? We can do that, right? You guys can set that up. It's actually pretty good if you go ahead and do that. And doing that again, take offload off the CPU, right? And in that case, you can go hand in hand and say, all right, I know it's, the ASIC now that's dedicated, right? That chip is dedicated to the SSLVPN. I have no problem. I can go ahead and run my debug command, right? But we have to make sure that the offloading process, right, is set up before we do so, right? And you can go ahead and test it. You can see it. And again, these chips, the developers that made it, the guys who created it, very smart, right? It can literally know what to siphon off as far as processes within SSLVPN. So you want to run your debug command after you do this, have at it, right? But even just as if it was assigned to the actual core CPU, you still have to be careful, just like how you were, just like how it is if you offload it to a specific ASIC chip. Okay, that makes sense.
Yep.
All right. With that being said, right. Last but not least, we have our 2 questions that I always ask you. Okay. So first questions. What does the SSL VPN monitor feature allow you to do? Is it A, monitor SSL VPN user actions such as authentication? Or is it B, force SSL VPN user disconnections?
B.
You said it's B?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
that's correct. All right. Question 2. Which statement about SSL VPN timers is correct? Is it A, SSL VPN timers can prevent logouts when SSL VPN users experience long network latency? Or is it B, the login timeout is a non-customizable hard value?
It's A.
A.
There we go. All right. Well, you guys have completed the SSL VPN section, but also you completed the